It wasn't the shove that changed everything. It wasn't the sound of her spine hitting the hard, laminated wood of the lab table, or the way the breath left her lungs in a silent, painful gasp. It was the sound of the glass. The delicate, high-pitched ping of a pristine beaker tipping over, then the catastrophic, echoing crash as it hit the floor and exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. In that moment, the entire world seemed to freeze, holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And what happened next was me, too, before we unravel the shocking truth of what unfolded in that lab. If you're ready for a story about hidden strength, and the moment the hunted becomes the hunter, you're in the right place. Subscribe and join us, because what you're about to witness is just the beginning. Her name was Emily. She was 19, a transfer student, a ghost trying to move through the crowded hallways of Northwood High without causing a ripple. On that first day, she was a study in quiet Shady's faded blue jeans, worn sneakers, and a simple olive green jacket that looked like something from an army surplus store. It was a far cry from the bright, branded hoodies and varsity jackets that were the unofficial uniform of the school's elite. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if holding herself together. To everyone who bothered to look, which was almost no one, she was just the new girl. Fragile. An easy target. The science lab was a bright, sprawling room, a temple of modernity filled with the sharp, clean scent of disinfectant and the underlying tang of chemicals. Warm afternoon sunlight streamed through the large, paned windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air above rows of black-topped tables. Each station was equipped with its own sink, gas valve, and a neat array of beakers, test tubes, and Erlenmeyer flasks filled with clear, colorless liquids for the day's experiment on chemical reactions. It was in this room, a place dedicated to order and predictable outcomes, that Chaos decided to make an entrance. His name was Chad, and he didn't just enter a room, he occupied it. Tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in a blue and yellow varsity jacket that screamed of football glory and unearned privilege, he moved with a swagger that demanded attention. He was flanked by his two lieutenants, Mark and Jason, smaller, louder replicas who amplified his presence like distorted speakers. They were the kings of this concrete jungle, and they just spotted fresh prey. The lesson was on acid-base reactions. The teacher, Mr. Henderson, a man more interested in the theoretical properties of bicarbonate soda than the social dynamics simmering in his classroom, had paired them up randomly. Fate, with a cruel sense of humor, had placed Emily with Chad. Great, Chad muttered loud enough for the entire back row to hear. Drawn the short straw. Gonna have to do all the work myself. He didn't look at Emily as he said it, his disdain a physical force. Emily said nothing. She simply pulled the worksheet closer, her movements economical and precise. She read the instructions once, her eyes scanning the lines with a focus that seemed intense, almost practiced. Okay, so we just pour this into that, right? Chad said, already grabbing for the beaker of acetic acid. Wait, Emily said, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. It was the first word she'd spoken to him. Chad froze, more out of surprise than obedience. What? The concentration is too high. You need to dilute it first with the distilled water, or the reaction will be too violent. It could splatter. She pointed a slender finger at the instruction sheet, where a small, italicized caution note was printed. Chad stared at her, then let out a short, barking laugh. What are you, the science police? I think I know how to pour one liquid into another. He turned to Mark and Jason, who were at the next table. Hear that? The new girl's trying to tell me how to do a kindergarten experiment. A slow, hot flush crept up Emily's neck. She didn't retort. Instead, she took a small step back, her shoulders curling inwards. The retreat was like blood in the water. The experiment proceeded, with Chad manhandling the equipment and Emily watching, a silent, tense statue. When it came time to mix the final reactants, Chad, showing off for a group of girls at the next table, decided to make it more interesting. He grabbed the beaker of diluted acid and the flask of baking soda solution. Let's see some real action, he announced, and with a theatrical flourish, he poured the entire beaker into the flask at once. The result was instantaneous and messy. A frothing, bubbling geyser of white foam erupted from the flask, cascading over the sides and onto the table, splattering Chad's precious varsity jacket. A moment of stunned silence was followed by a roar of laughter from the surrounding students. Chad's face, initially shocked, morphed into a mask of pure, undiluted rage. The humiliation was public, and it was recorded. Several phones were already out, capturing the moment for posterity. He needed a scapegoat, and his eyes, blazing with fury, landed on Emily. "This is your fault," he seethed, his voice a low, venomous whisper. Emily, who had been carefully wiping down her side of the table, looked up, her expression unreadable. "You didn't follow the procedure. I tried to warn you." Her calmness was like gasoline on the fire of his anger. "You tried to warn me," he mocked, his voice rising to a shout. "You think you're so smart. You think you're better than me. You're nothing. You're a nobody. A ghost." He took a step towards her. The background chatter died down. This was better than a foaming flask. This was live action drama. "Just leave me alone," Emily said, her voice gaining a slight, barely perceptible tremor. She took another step back, her hip bumping against the edge of their lab table. "Leave you alone." Chad laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I just want to make sure you understand your place." He gestured to the mess on his jacket. "You see this? You're going to pay my dry cleaning bill. You're going to apologize to the whole class for being such a know-it-all freak." The injustice of it was breathtaking. The other students watched, a few looking uncomfortable, but none daring to intervene. Mark and Jason moved to flank Chad, their smirks a clear signal of support. "I'm not apologizing for your mistake," Emily said. Her voice was still quiet, but the tremor was gone. It was flat, cold. That was the final straw, the public defiance, in front of his crew, in front of an audience with their phones raised. This quiet, mousy girl was standing her ground. Chad's brain, fueled by rage and a desperate need to reassert dominance, short-circuited. "Your place," he snarled, "is right here." He lunged. It wasn't a gentle push. It was a two-handed, full-force shove to her shoulders. Emily was light, and the force was brutal and unexpected. She flew backwards, a cry of surprise ripped from her throat, her body crashing onto the lab table. Her back slammed against the hard surface, the impact jarring the entire setup. The beaker that had been teetering on the edge from Chad's earlier carelessness finally went over, followed by 2 glass stirring rods and a rack of empty test tubes. The sound was symphonic in its destruction, a cascade of shattering glass that seemed to go on forever. For a second there was absolute silence, broken only by the final tink, tink, tink of a spinning shard of glass coming to rest. Emily lay sprawled on the table, surrounded by the glittering wreckage. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a kind of stunned disbelief. A thin line of blood welled from a small cut on her forearm where a piece of glass had nicked her. Chad stood over her, his chest heaving, a triumphant, ugly smile on his face. "See, that's what happens." But the triumph was short-lived. The silence stretched, becoming heavy, uncomfortable. The students who had been recording now held their phones more hesitantly. This had crossed a line from bullying into something darker, something that felt criminal. And then Emily moved. It wasn't the slow, pained movement of someone injured. It was fluid, deliberate. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, then swung her legs off the table, her sneakers crunching on the glass as she landed firmly on her feet. She didn't look at the cut on her arm. She didn't brush the glass fragments from her jacket. She simply stood there, and as she raised her head to look at Chad, the entire energy in the room shifted. The shy, fragile girl was gone. In her place was someone else entirely. Her posture was straight, her shoulders squared. The calm on her face had hardened into something unyielding. Her eyes, which had been downcast all day, now held a glint of cold, focused intensity. It was the look of a soldier assessing a threat. Chad, for the first time, felt a prickle of unease. "What, you gonna cry now? Go ahead, cry for the cameras." Emily didn't cry. She took a single, slow step towards him. The crunch of glass under her foot was the only sound in the dead, quiet room. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. Her voice was different. It was low, resonant, and carried an authority that silenced the last remaining whispers. It was a voice used to being obeyed, or what? Chad scoffed, trying to reclaim his bravado. But it sounded hollow now. "What are you gonna do, you little?" He never finished the sentence. In a movement so fast it was a blur, Emily's right hand snapped out. It wasn't a wild, emotional slap. It was a precise, open-handed strike, the heel of her palm connecting with the center of Chad's chest. It wasn't the force of the blow that was shocking, it was the result. A sound like a tire deflating, a choked whoosh of air erupted from Chad's mouth. His eyes bulged, all the arrogance draining from his face, replaced by pure, uncomprehending agony. His legs buckled, and he collapsed to his knees, clutching his sternum, gasping like a fish out of water. He couldn't draw a full breath. Mark and Jason stared, their jaws slack. The scene was so alien, so utterly impossible, that their brains couldn't process it. The quiet girl had just dropped him, with one touch. "Stay down," Emily commanded, her voice still that chilling, calm monotone. But Mark, driven by a combination of loyalty and stupidity, rushed her. "You bitch!" He swung a wild, looping punch. Emily didn't flinch. She simply shifted her weight, her body flowing to the side with an unnatural grace. As his momentum carried him forward, her left hand shot out, grabbing his swinging wrist. She used his own force against him, twisting his arm in a controlled, vicious arc while her right foot hooked behind his ankle. It was a seamless, almost beautiful maneuver. Mark yelped in pain and surprise as he was flipped onto his back on the floor, landing with a heavy thud that rattled the beakers on the nearest tables. He lay there, groaning, his arm pinned at an awkward angle. Jason, the last one standing, froze. The fight had gone out of him. He looked from Chad, still wheezing on his knees, to Mark, writhing on the floor, and finally to Emily, who stood between them, her expression unchanged. She hadn't even broken a sweat. She turned her gaze to him. "Do you want to try?" Jason, pale and trembling, slowly raised his hands in surrender, shaking his head frantically. The classroom was a tomb. The phones were still recording, but now they were capturing a different story altogether. The story of the predator who had stumbled upon a predator far more dangerous. Emily's eyes scanned the room, meeting the stunned gazes of her classmates. No one dared to move. She then looked down at Chad, who was finally managing to draw ragged, painful breaths. She knelt down, bringing her face level with his. The proximity made him flinch. "You think strength is about shoving people around," she whispered, the words meant only for him, yet carrying in the silent room. "You think power is a loud voice in a letterman's jacket. You're a child playing at being a king." She paused, letting the words sink in. "My name is Emily Hayes. My father was Sergeant First Class Michael Hayes. For the last 3 years, I didn't go to high school. I lived on an army base. Every day, after my classes via satellite, I trained. Krav Maga, Jiu-Jitsu, close quarters combat. I learned how to disarm a man twice your size. I learned how to use pressure points to cause paralyzing pain. I learned how to turn a pen, a set of keys, or a shattered piece of glass into a weapon. I did this not to feel powerful, but to feel safe after the world took my dad from me. This jacket," she said, plucking at the sleeve of her olive green top, "was his. It's the only thing I have left of him. You put your hands on me while I was wearing it. That was your first mistake." She stood up, looking down at him with a pity that was somehow more terrifying than her anger. "Your second mistake was thinking I was weak because I'm quiet. The quiet ones, Chad, were the ones who have already seen the worst the world has to offer. We don't need to shout about it." She turned and began to walk calmly towards the classroom door. The students parted for her like the Red Sea, their phones lowering, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Just as her hand touched the door handle, Mr. Henderson finally found his voice. "Young lady, you can't just, there will be consequences." Emily stopped and looked back over her shoulder, not at the teacher, but at Chad, who was still on his knees. "I know," she said softly, "for them." And with that, she pulled the door open and walked out, leaving behind a room full of shattered glass, shattered egos, and a dozen silent, recording witnesses who had just learned a lesson they would never, ever forget. The fallout was swift and brutal, but not for Emily. The videos, of course, went viral. Not just the one of her being shoved, but the one of her stunning retaliation. The narrative flipped instantly. Chad, Mark, and Jason weren't seen as victims. They were the architects of their own very public, very humiliating downfall. They were suspended, and Chad, a star athlete with college scouts looking at him, saw his offers evaporate overnight. The true consequence was the loss of their social standing. They became pariahs, cautionary tales. But the most profound change was in the school's atmosphere itself. A silent understanding settled over the halls that the currency of power had been permanently devalued. That true strength was no longer measured in volume or violence, but in a quiet, unassailable competence. The library became a more popular place, and the bullies who remained learned a new, valuable skill: the ability to identify the difference between silence and weakness. A lesson that would serve them far better in the long run than any touchdown ever could. Emily was brought before the principal, but with the video evidence and the testimony of dozens of students, the school had little choice. She was acting in self-defense after a physically violent assault. She was given a warning for the fight, but it was a mere formality. She didn't become popular. She didn't suddenly become the queen of the school. That wasn't her, but the whispers that followed her in the hallways were no longer of mockery. They were whispers of respect, of awe. People gave her a wide berth, but now it was out of reverence, not dismissal. She had done what every bullied, quiet kid dreams of doing. She had not just fought back, she had redefined the entire power structure of the school with two flawless, devastating moves. A week after the incident, she was sitting alone at a table in the far corner of the library. A girl from her chemistry class, a quiet girl named Sarah who always had her head in a book, approached her hesitantly. "Emily," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Emily looked up from her textbook. I wanted to say thank you," Sarah said, her cheeks flushing, "for what you did. Not just for yourself, but for all of us." Emily gave a small, genuine smile, the first one anyone had seen from her. "You don't have to thank me. You just have to remember that you're stronger than they want you to think you are." She went back to her book, and Sarah walked away, standing a little taller. Emily Hayes wasn't a bully. She wasn't a hero seeking glory. She was a force of nature. A quiet reminder that strength isn't always loud, that trauma can forge a spirit of steel, and that you should never, ever judge a person by the silence they keep. The bullies had thrown the new girl on the lab table, hoping to break her. Instead, they broke the one thing they valued most, their own illusion of control. And in the glittering wreckage of that broken glass, they were left with nothing but the desperate, hollow echo of their own begged mercy. This story of hidden strength resonates differently depending on where you are. From which part of the country are you watching this video? Let me know in the comments below.